This presentation is basically composed of three parts: a quick reference of how Cuba was prior to 1959, an outline of the events which took place following the revolutionary government takeover, which caused the parents to make the heart-wrenching decision of sending their children alone out of Cuba to the United States, and the Pedro Pan Exodus story. In the 1950s, Cuba was, socially and economically, a relatively advanced country, certainly by Latin American standards and, in some areas, by world standards. And this included areas such as the economy, education, and healthcare. But things were not perfect. Cuba had been going through a period of political instability and corruption, plus the normal aspirations of citizens for a better life led Cubans to believe in the promises made by the revolutionaries fighting in the mountains and in the cities to overthrow the Batista government in power at that time. Fidel Castro took power in Cuba on January 1, 1959. He was the leader of one of the movements against the Batista government. Cubans were jubilant and hopeful that stability and free elections would finally return to their country. But soon the new revolutionary government began to transform into an authoritarian and totalitarian regime. Individual liberties were abolished. Incarcerations and summary executions for political reasons took place without due process, just for suspicion of counter-revolutionary activities. And free elections never took place. Committees for the defense of the revolution were established on each block by the government. These committees expected citizens to report to the government on the daily lives and anti-revolutionary activities and feelings of neighbors, colleagues, friends, and family members. Even suspicion of anti-revolutionary feelings and activities resulted in harassment and could land people in jail. Following are other examples of human rights violations, which were a sure sign of the type of authoritarian and totalitarian government which was taking hold of the island. All independent news media, such as newspapers, television, and radio stations, were slowly taken over and became under government control. The National Institute of Agrarian Reform was established, which expropriated a large number of private landholdings. The government expropriated landholdings of a certain size and distributed them to farmers who then had control of production but not of ownership. The Urban Reform Law nationalized all privately owned residential rental real estate. Therefore, all privately held rental property became part of the communist state. Cuban currency was changed. Cubans with a bank account could change only up to 10,000 pesos and take out only 100 pesos per month. Anyone without a bank account could change only 200 pesos. This affected inheritances and savings people had for things such as their children's future and retirement. Privately owned Cuban and foreign companies of all sizes were taken over by the government. Cubans were prohibited from freely traveling abroad unless they had written permission from the government. Many Cubans were made to relinquish all possessions, including their homes, in exchange for permission to leave. Also, special permission was required to return to the island, so if you left, you could not return freely. Public religious services were banned. For example, in September 1961, the traditional religious procession to celebrate the Day of Our Lady of Charity was interrupted by the government with violence. Government seized all private schools and intensified Marxist indoctrination. A new education reform law was established, stating that education is the responsibility of the revolutionary government, a responsibility it must not delegate nor transfer. Therefore, the communist government assumed sole responsibility for the education of the youth. Schools closed for 8 months so the government could restructure its new education system and implement its new education reform law. During this time, the government also created the literacy campaign and established alphabetization journeys to teach reading and writing to peasants and others. Youths were encouraged to join, which took them away from their families, often without adequate supervision for long periods of time. La Cartilla was the teaching manual used in the literacy campaign. La Cartilla was used not only to teach reading and writing, but also to teach the students and the youths teaching them the new revolutionary government politics and the new revolutionary way of thinking. Groups of youths were also sent to the communist bloc countries for long periods of study and indoctrination in the communist ideology. The United States Catholic newspaper The Voice reported in January 1961 that Cuba and the Soviet Union exchanged 1,000 youngsters to work and learn on each other's farms. Many of these children, in their early teens or younger, would not be returned to Cuba in months or even years. Youth paramilitary organizations were established by the government through the schools. In addition to training the youths on the new revolutionary government way of thinking, in these organizations, youths were expected to spy and report on their parents' daily lives and on their parents' anti-revolutionary feelings and activities. Some organizations even trained youths to operate rapid-fire automatic guns, supposedly to defend the country from enemy attack. It should be noted that while activities and initiatives such as the youth paramilitary organizations, the alphabetization journeys far away from home, and the long education and indoctrination assignments in the Soviet Union were not mandatory at the time, parents not in favor of their children's participation in them were seen as uncooperative with the new revolutionary government, which placed them in an unfavorable situation, which many times included harassment. Parents began to look for ways to take the children out of Cuba, until the children could safely return to Cuba once the communist dictatorship was toppled, because most parents did not believe the communist government would last in power long, or until the parents could reunite with their children in the United States. Many parents adopted a wait-and-see attitude before beginning the plans to leave the island. Operation Pedro Pan is born. James Baker was the headmaster of Roston Academy, an American private school in Havana. Parents in Cuba came to him for assistance in taking their children out of the island away from the repressive government. Father Brian O. Walsh was the director of the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami. He realized that, among all Cubans arriving in Miami fleeing the repressive government, came children unaccompanied without their parents. The plan in action. Baker and Walsh met in Miami in early December 1960. The plan was that Baker in Cuba would send Walsh in Miami, through embassy pouches, the names of children whose parents wished to take them out of Cuba unaccompanied to escape repression and indoctrination. Walsh would obtain the required student visas and would send them to Baker in Cuba through embassy pouches. He also secured places in Miami for the children who had no relatives or friends in the United States. Walsh also obtained approval from the United States government to use federal funds for the care of Cuban unaccompanied minors. On December 26, 1960, the first Pedro Pan children traveled alone to the United States using student visas. The number of unaccompanied children begins as a trickle. Half of the children were met in Miami and stayed with relatives or friends. Children who had no one in the United States were placed in group homes and other facilities managed by the Catholic Welfare Bureau, led by Father Walsh. And here you see two of the first group homes. End of the plan. On January 3, 1961, United States-Cuba diplomatic relations were severed. Therefore, the United States Embassy stopped issuing visas. With no more U.S. visas being issued, it seemed that the unaccompanied children exodus would be coming to an end. In one of his later interviews, Father Walsh said that, when this occurred, he thought to himself, "Well, at least we tried." In early January 1961, James Baker joined Father Walsh in Miami to help find a new solution for the problem of the Cuban children. Initial solution: to send the children to the United States via Jamaica. The British authorities in Kingston were willing to grant student visas to those entering under the Baker-Walsh plan. The children would then be given visas to travel to the United States from Jamaica. The Catholic Bishop of Kingston secured lodging for the short stay required before traveling to the United States. In mid-January 1961, the United States State Department invited Father Walsh to a meeting in Washington to discuss a new solution for the problem of the unaccompanied Cuban children. At this meeting, the United States State Department authorized the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami to issue visa waivers to children in Cuba. Here is a photo of Father Walsh and Abraham Ribikoff, the United States Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in early 1961. Here are samples of visa waivers. Visa waivers allow the children to leave Cuba for the United States without a visa. A steady stream of children continues arriving in Miami. Children were met at the Miami airport by George Warch, a Catholic welfare employee who made sure the children were well taken care of and took them through the immigration process. Then he would take to the camps or group homes those who had no family or friends meeting them at the airport. During the first few months of the Exodus, Mr. James Baker and other volunteers also took care of the children at the airport and transported them to the camps and group homes. Mr. Baker was also one of the first house parents of the unaccompanied Cuban children's program. During the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro mobilized all available forces. Men as young as 14 and 15 years old were deployed in the battle zone. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion increased government repression and fears of losing the children to the communist government. That is when Operation Pedro Pan really kicked up into high gear. Priests and nuns were forced to leave Cuba. Visa waiver distribution continues throughout the island at a faster pace, and the children's exodus goes into overdrive. In December 1961, Fidel Castro indicates that for many years he had been a Marxist-Leninist and would be for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, there was a large underground movement inside Cuba to get the children out. Visa waiver distribution continues throughout the island at a faster pace, and a large group of courageous people inside the island distributed the visa waivers. And here are the names and photos of some of those courageous people. Now the children's exodus goes into overdrive. Children with no one in the United States were placed in group homes and camps managed by the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami, led by Father Walsh. Following are photos of children in those camps and group homes. Here's the Jesuit boys' residence. Here is St. Raphael's Hall. Here is Kendall Camp. Here is Florida City Camp. Matecumbe Camp. Opalaca Camp. And Whitehall Group Home. Because the number of children arriving daily in Miami was very large, Group homes and other shelters reached overcapacity. Therefore, licensed care facilities such as group homes, orphanages, boarding schools, and foster homes in over 100 cities in over 35 states were made available. Then the children began to be transferred to these places all over the United States, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. One of the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was that flights between Cuba and the United States stopped. And this ended not only the exodus of unaccompanied children in the United States, but the parents of those children already in the United States were not able to travel to reunite with their children. Some were able to leave through third countries, but not many were able to do this. Needless to say, the hopes of reunification of parents and children was devastating. By this time, 14,048 children had left Cuba for the United States without their parents. Of those, 6,496 received foster care upon arrival or shortly thereafter. Separation of many parents and children lasted about 3 years, until Cuba and the United States reached an agreement to create the Freedom Flights in December 1965. Parents of unaccompanied children in the United States were given first priority, and within 6 months, most parents were able to reunite with their children in the United States. However, many parents were unable to leave for different reasons, such as Cuban government refusal to release them, loyalty to their own aged parents, political imprisonment of other family members, or military service of other children. Who were the Pedro Pan children? They came from all races and classes of society, but the majority were the children of middle-class families, most of them attending private schools in Cuba. Most were between the ages of 12 and 16. 70% were boys over 12. Of the 14,048 children, most were Catholic, and there were 396 Jewish, 700 Protestant, and others with no religious affiliation. Funding for the program was made available by the federal government. The funds were distributed through various Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and other agencies located in over 100 cities in over 35 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Why the name Pedro Pan? The Miami news media coined the term as an analogy of the Disney character Peter Pan, the boy who flew to Never Never Land. Gene Miller of the Miami Herald and Ralph Rennick of WTVJ Channel 4 were the first ones to use the term Operation Pedro Pan. Pedro Pans no doubt had a rough time adjusting to the new culture, language, and being away from their families. However, they pulled through and flourished in their new country, thanks to the values inculcated in them by their parents, the values of family ties and traditions, love of country, the importance of obtaining an education, and a strong work ethic. This is also the story of the sacrifice the Cuban parents had to make by sending their children alone to a foreign country to save them from the horrors of the dictatorship in the making. They certainly had to take a leap of faith to save their children from the communist dictatorship which was taking over the island. They are the true heroes of this story. Pedro Pans today are like brothers and sisters. We like to get together to reminisce, exchange stories about our Pedro Pan experiences, and to make new friends. Most Pedro Pan archives, documents, and memorabilia are kept in 3 places: the Barry University Archives, the University of Miami Library's Cuban Heritage Collection, and the Florida International University Special Collections Archives. These are some of the sources used for this presentation. And thank you for your interest in our Pedro Pan Exodus story.